Uh, it's a great pleasure and privilege to have Dan Klein with us today. As you know, he's professor of economic at Mercator Center at GMU. No need to introduce him here. I only want to mention his great book on knowledge and coordination, which is now nearly or a bit more than 10 years old. And tonight, his talk will deal with two scholars who are my personal favorite guides, Adam Smith and David Hume. By the way, he is also director or leader of a program on Smithian political economy at GMU. So without further ado, I would give the floor to you, Dan, and we are very much looking forward to your talk tonight.
Fantastic. I want to share screen, if I can figure out how to do that.
You succeeded.
Okay, that's always good. This movie's being recorded, okay. And Jacob is here with us tonight. I'm going to handle the presentation, but I hope Jacob will be able to contribute. Yeah, why lords went for luxuries. Now, notice this long timeline we're going to actually cover. The lords going for luxuries is the last part of this story. It's the third of 3 acts, you could say. And the big question is, what was this? What were they up to? Like, my precious, why did they go for this? Hirschman says, in fact, the episode is better summarized as a victory of the passions of cupidity and luxury over the long-run interests of the lords than of the taming of the passions by the interests. Now, just to refresh everybody, I think everyone's kind of acquainted with the story in Smith about the lords having been powerful and important, and having a lot of retainers, retinues, affiliations, armies that they would spend their money on, hosting big feasts and just making these guys dependent, who could then be called on for service and power. Instead, trading that away once they could, because commerce had developed diamond buckles. And so the question is, why would they trade away all their power for these silly baubles? Hirschman says this again. One cannot help feeling that in this particular instance, Smith overplayed his invisible hand. For the derisive and even savage manner of the account he gives of the folly of the lords raises the question in the reader's mind how the lords could have been quite so blind to their class interest. And I think another way of putting this conundrum, you might say, is to look at, let's see, I got this thing in my way here on my screen. Let's see, here we go. Is to look at the later period monarchs and how dandied up they are. There's Henry VIII, and some of the others. And then here's some of the others. Philip, the husband. And then to the Stuarts, who are especially rather dandy. Here's Charles I. Oh, and then the interregnum, these two Cromwells look quite different. But then we get back to the Stuarts and they look very fabulous, you might say. And similarly with the French, you kind of see it starting here, especially if you compare to the earlier photos at these Wikipedia list of the monarchs, you can kind of make a comparison. And then this gets especially pronounced here in the Bourbons. This one is, I think, must really take the cake. And kind of like the point is, what would this guy's great-great-grandfather have thought if he saw Louis XIV, if you saw this photo? I think there's a fair chance he'd be quite mortified. And so that's like another way of kind of posing this conundrum. Now, just want to move this menu thing around a bit. So I want to go back. I want to say a little bit more about the third act, and that's the barons transformed. We're doing a periodization that, is of course very rough and just for sort of a helpful simplification. And let's look at the passage itself in The Wealth of Nations. But what all the violence of feudal institutions could not have effective, the operation of commerce brought about. These gradually furnished the proprietors with something for which they could exchange the whole surplus that they could consume themselves without sharing with their tenants and retainers. All for ourselves and nothing for other people seems in every age of the world to have been the vile maxims of the masters of mankind. And soon, therefore, as they could find a method of consuming the whole value, they had no disposition to share. For a pair of diamond buckles or something as frivolous, they exchanged the maintenance of 1,000 men a year, and with it the whole weight and authority which it could give them. The buckles, however, were to be all their own, and no other human creature was to have any share of them, whereas in the more ancient method of expense, they must have shared with at least 1,000 people. With the judges that were to determine the preference, this difference was perfectly decisive, and thus for the gratification of the most childish and meanest and the most sordid of all vanities, they gradually bartered their whole power and authority. By the way, I should say that the diamond buckles dynamic also gets applied to the clergy, but we're just focusing on Smith's application of the lords, the barons. And he says it's not the only place in The Wealth of Nations where he says this. There's this other passage here that's very noteworthy. And you get the diamond buckles dynamic and story in the LJ. And this is the general part of the story in Smith that I think we all kind of get, of the subduing of the nobles and the establishment of regular government. So the diamond buckles effect is all part of that, a kind of more functional integrated nation state, particularly under the Tudors and moving forward. Now, we're going to tell a story about what's going on here that's largely kind of drawn from the LJ. It's developed more in the LJ, though rather unclearly and chaotically. And then you might say, well, if you've got a story about what's going on here, why didn't he intimate that in the Wealth of Nations? And what's funny is I think this little bit here, which rather goes unnoticed, does slightly intimate it. With the judges that were to determine the preference. In other words, these preferences don't come from nowhere. And they didn't arise simply because now you could get your hands on some diamond buckles. That's the story we're going to tell. So to jump back now in time to lead, and then we'll come back to Act 3. Act 1 is feuda develops. And so we're picking up with the collapse of the Roman Empire, allodial lords, they do not hold of anyone. It's not clear that like the king really even means very much, or what it even means for someone to be the king in this kind of context. And we do develop feudal manners with lords, tenants owing the military service and rent to the allodial lord. This starts off at will, where the lord can basically toss the guy out at will. Then it becomes lifetime, and there's a term for that, and then hereditary, and that is called feuda. Okay. Also, these agreements could revert back to the lord under certain conditions. That's just a note, really. So we've got feuda is hereditary liege relationships, that is to say, lord-vassal relationships. But then in Act 2, this feuda flips up to the king. See, it doesn't start off being all down from the king. It's more like feuda happens from bottom up, and it flips up to the king. And this is I think the general story here. This relationship, then hereditariness, flips up to the king. Weaker lords seek protection by allying with greater lords, and they concede to hold their lands of the greater lords. The greater lords are in danger of others or coalitions of others, so they ask the assistance of the king and strike the same kind of bargain. I think it stands to reason, not that Smith explicitly says this in the LJ, that they have a sense of the focal point, of a focal point in a king, in what is emerging as a territorial notion of the state, a basis for a convention against lawless side-by-side violence. So Smith says this in LJ, or this general result. By this means it was that in about 500 or 600 years after the destruction of the Roman Empire, that is to say, that would be sometime in the 1000 something, all the west of Europe was brought under the feudal government. So feudal government now means actually the feuda flipping all the way up to the king. He says that prior historians misunderstood this flipping up and why it happened. They said it was because of the power of the lords demanding hereditary rights to their lands from the king. But he actually says, but it was actually the contrary, and that it was the power of the king, or the centricity of the king, that this flipping up occurred. So, this helps to sort out the polysemy of feudal, that is to say, the different meanings of feudal. And there's three facets here worth distinguishing: the liege relationship, that is lord-vassal type relationship. Then two, that becoming hereditary or feuda to the local manor, okay, just on that feudal manor. And then this whole thing flipping up to the king in like a system-wide way, which is then what Smith means by feudal government when it assumes all three, okay? So this is what's mainly happening here in Act 2. Now, this is not to say that they're all suddenly totally subdued and peaceful. They maintain autonomous power. They fought amongst themselves, and they had to kind of keep up with the Plantagenets with violence capacity and martial ability. Meanwhile, you do have the commerce of the cities growing and so on, like Smith says. And that suggested some things in political organization, I would say. Hume also, is very keen on emphasizing the violence of this period and how other professions other than arms were held in contempt, and that if you developed any wealth or opulence, he would be afraid of having it stripped from him, just like in lawless governments always in history. And then there's the military revolution, the cannon, and the development of that. That makes offense stronger. It kind of changes the balance between offense and defense. You can knock down castle walls with cannons. And so barons are now like, yeah, this isn't so great. It's a little bit like these wars are too costly for everyone involved. And Smith says something close to this point about the cannon. Okay, so then back to Act 3. Now I've added more to this title: barons transformed by the judges that were to determine the preference. So the lords are increasing in number, and first of all, it became cumbersome to call them all to parliament or to court, and they began to summon some of them. Not all, but some. Okay. And the possibility of doing this developed at this time. And so there's two things that are being done by special letter. And the letter could be private by writ or public by letters patent. And there's two different things being done now making someone a baron at all and inviting someone to court or parliament, whether they are or are not already a baron. And then it's like, well, if this guy's not a baron and he comes to the meeting of barons, it's like, well, why is he here? And then it's like, well, we made him a baron. We've decided to make him a baron. So then you getting at the same time, it's coeval, it seems, barons by writ or by letters patent, which I think comes a bit later. And so this is what's happened, this kind of selection, basically two-tiered nobility now. There's those who have once been, denominated a noble by tenure, by letter, by writ, or by patent. And then there's the question of who actually gets to come to the party, who actually gets to rub shoulders, okay? And Hume too talks about this, and he also uses to be determined by the discretion of the king and his ministers. There's that same word, determined. But they haven't gone soft yet, realize. And so here again are Smith's words with the judges from Wealth of Nations, from the judges that were to determine the preference. This was perfectly decisive. See, once you see this other part of the bigger picture, you realize that there's something here more to the story. It's not just that everybody, would like to get their hands on some little precious like Gollum. It's partly that people have been led to have that preference for certain reasons. Okay, how do you signal wealth, power, importance now in this age where people are being selectively invited to court or to parliament? You can't bring 1,000 guys with you. What do? You show the really expensive diamond buckles and everything else, right? This is like a Klein Loeffler signaling model, like they say about, that's one reason people advertise at the Super Bowl, because they can. That they're around. Why do the banks put up these big marble pillars? Because they're in for the long term, and so on. Okay, so yeah. So this is just more elaboration. I'll skip this. And so the barons start to demilitarize, pardon me. But they do not, lose this taste immediately. But generally, it starts to happen. And this way of signaling and the dandyism, if you will, kind of becomes very dominant and a way of showing your importance. And you can see this trend now. There's several figures here that Jacob has put together through data, some of which he collected himself. You see the decline in castle building as this centralization and sort of pacification continues. This is Act 3 here, you could say, in the pink is what we're saying. And here's decline in elite violent death. It was high, and then this pacification starts happening, the diamond buckles effect, and we get a very big drop. And here's itinerant kingship. This is the king roaming around, England, to get people to go along with what he says and to meet them and everything else. And it used to be he went around a lot, and then during the Tudors, they came to him. He didn't move around so much, or she. And likewise, the rise of Parliament. This is number of days of Parliament in session. And so now, it's not, things are being settled more and more in Parliament, and people are coming to the central spot of Parliament. And so this is my final slide. Barons turn into, you could say, dandies, military officers, because that's now like their thing. They want to fit in with their macho stuff, part of this period into the new centralized structure. Parliamentarians, Hume's honest gentlemen, and bourgeois. Yeah, so that's it, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Yes, thanks a lot indeed, Dan. The floor is open for